What happens when a mission designed to be routine turns into a complete disappearance with no warning, no witnesses, and no immediate explanation? That question sits at the center of this story, because on that morning, nothing about the briefing suggested disaster. Weather reports were acceptable, aircraft were fully operational, fuel calculations were conservative, and the pilots were not rookies. They were experienced, disciplined, and confident. In military aviation, this was the kind of sortie commanders barely worried about, the kind that usually ended with boring debriefings and predictable reports. And that false sense of normality is exactly what made what happened next so devastating. The squadron lifted off in tight formation, engines synchronized, climbing steadily toward their assigned altitude. Radio chatter was calm, almost casual. There was no hint of fear, no sense of urgency, no signal that history was about to fracture. Missions like this had been flown dozens of times before, following the same routes, the same timings, the same procedures drilled into every pilot until they became instinct. Predictability was considered safety. Discipline was survival. And that assumption would be fatally tested. Within minutes, the formation disappeared beyond the horizon, exactly as planned. From the ground, everything looked perfect. But in the air, subtle variables were already shifting. Small deviations in visibility, slight changes in cloud density, the kind of environmental details that rarely mattered until suddenly they did. War has a way of punishing routines, especially when both sides have learned each other's habits too well. And somewhere ahead, unseen and unaccounted for, something was waiting. The first sign that the mission was no longer routine came not as an explosion or a warning, but as confusion. Radio traffic became irregular. One transmission overlapped another. A call sign repeated itself twice, then stopped. These were tiny anomalies, the kind that might be dismissed in real time, but in hindsight they would become chilling markers. Experienced pilots sense danger, not through alarms, but through patterns breaking. And patterns were breaking fast. Then came the moment no operations officer ever wants to experience. The radio went quiet. Not static, not interference. Silence. One aircraft failed to respond. Then another. Then all of them. In the span of seconds, an entire squadron vanished from the operational picture. No distress call, no mayday, no reports of enemy contact, just absent. In military aviation, silence is never neutral. Silence is a message, and it is rarely a good one. Back at base, confusion spread faster than fear. Controllers tried every frequency. Backup channels, emergency protocols. Nothing. Aircraft that should have been checking in at fixed intervals simply never did. At first, there was denial. Radios failed. Signals bounce. Someone suggested atmospheric interference. Someone else blamed equipment. But deep down, everyone knew those explanations were thin. Radios might fail one aircraft, maybe two, but not an entire formation at once. What made this disappearance especially unsettling was that it violated the expectations of how disaster normally unfolds. In combat aviation, losses usually come with noise, chaos, frantic calls, warnings shouted over open channels. This time there was none of that. The squadron didn't fight, didn't retreat, didn't scatter. It simply ceased to exist as a coherent force. And that raised a terrifying possibility. Whatever happened was so sudden, so overwhelming, that no one had time to react. As minutes turned into an hour, the weight of the situation settled in. Search procedures were discussed, but uncertainty paralyzed this. Where do you search when you don't know where contact was lost? How do you look for wreckage when there was no reported engagement? Every assumption about the mission's safety now worked against understanding its failure. The very routine nature of the sortie erased clear points of reference. And then, just as the situation reached its most hopeless point, something unexpected happened. A single transmission cut through the silence. Weak, distorted, barely intelligible. One call sign, one voice. Juan, pilot. Against every logical expectation, someone was coming back, not with answers, but with a story so improbable that it would challenge everything commanders thought they understood about air combat, enemy tactics, and survival itself, because this was not just the story of a squadron that vanished. It was the story of how one pilot returned carrying an explanation that sounded impossible. An explanation that would later force militaries to confront an uncomfortable truth about predictability, doctrine, and the hidden costs of routine in war. If this opening already changed how you see routine missions and silent disasters in air combat, this is exactly the moment to pause and engage. Understanding stories like this is not just about history. It is about recognizing how small assumptions can erase entire squadrons, and how one unexpected decision can rewrite everything we think we know about survival in war. Take a second to leave a comment below and tell me what you think really caused the squadron to vanish before a single shot was reported. Was it a TRAPA, technological blind spot, or something even more unsettling? Your perspective matters here. If this story is making you rethink how air combat really unfolds behind official reports, hit the like button so this analysis reaches more people who care about military history beyond surface explanations. And make sure you are subscribed to the channel, because the next part reveals what that lone pilot actually saw in the sky and why his account was almost buried forever. The lone pilot would later say that the last normal radio transmission felt almost boring on that detail. Mattered more than anyone realized at the time. There was no urgency in the voice, no coded warning, no sign of enemy contact. It was a routine status update, delivered with the calm tone of men who believed they were still in control of the situation. That transmission became the final anchor to normality, the last moment when the squadron still existed as a coordinated unit instead of a mystery. Seconds after that message, the airspace changed in a way no briefing had prepared them for. The first disruption was subtle, a faint distortion in the radio, like a breath of static that lasted less than a second. It was easy to ignore. Combat pilots hear interference all the time. Weather, terrain, distance, all of it can bend signals. But then another pilot tried to speak, and his transmission cut off mid-sentence. Not fading, not breaking up, just stopping as if someone had flipped a switch. That was the moment any crept into the cockpit. Experienced pilots rely on rhythm. Call, response, confirmation. When that rhythm breaks, instinct takes over before logic does. One aircraft called again using a secondary frequency. No answer. Another tried an emergency channel. Silence. Not static. Not jamming noise. Just nothing. The absence itself became threatening. Inside the formation, spacing began to stretch as pilots scanned their instruments, eyes darting between the horizon and their radio panels. This was not how aerial engagements began. There were no contrails, no enemy silhouettes, no warning from radar. Yet something was clearly wrong. The lone survivor later described the sensation as flying into a void where the sky looked normal but behaved differently, as if the rules had quietly shifted. Then came the transmission that would haunt investigators for decades. A single voice broke through, strained and uneven, speaking too fast, words overlapping each other. The pilot reported visual contact with something he could not clearly identify. He never finished the sentence. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving behind only a brief carrier tone before silence returned. That fragment would later be replayed countless times, analyzed word by word, but no one could agree on exactly what he had seen. From that point on, communication collapsed entirely. Aircraft that should have been visible off the wings simply were not there anymore. The survivor checked his mirrors, adjusted altitude, banked slightly to regain visual contact. But the formation was gone. Not scattered, gone. No falling aircraft, no smoke, no parachutes. Just empty sky where minutes earlier dozens of planes had flown together. Back at base, the radio operators experienced the same unnerving pattern. One moment, multiple aircraft checking in as expected. The next, total silence across all assigned frequencies. Controllers attempted to raise the squadron repeatedly, cycling through protocols drilled for exactly this scenario. Nothing worked. Even emergency beacons failed to activate. It was as if every aircraft had been removed from the network simultaneously. What made this silence especially disturbing was how clean it was. In known cases of ambush or mass shootdowns, chaos leaves traces: overlapping mayday calls, clipped warnings, shouted coordinates. Here, there was none of that. The disappearance did not sound violent. It sounded deliberate, precise, almost surgical. That realization would later fuel theories that the squadron had not simply been destroyed, but neutralized in a way that bypassed conventional combat altogether. Inside the survivor's cockpit, isolation set in fast. He was now flying alone through airspace that moments earlier had been crowded with friendly aircraft. Every instinct told him to turn back, but doctrine demanded confirmation first. He attempted one final broadcast, repeating the last known call signs, asking for acknowledgement. His voice echoed back to him through his own headset, unanswered. That was when the psychological weight of the silence truly hit. Silence in war is never passive. It is either the calm before violence or the aftermath of something catastrophic. And in that moment, with no explosions, no enemy in sight, and no friendly voices responding, the survivor realized he was flying through the aftermath. This moment would later redefine how militaries interpreted loss of communication, forcing a painful reassessment of assumptions about what silence actually means in modern warfare. Because whatever happened to the squadron did not announce itself with fire or noise. It erased them quietly, efficiently, and without warning. 4 years after the incident, investigators focused on the obvious questions first: enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, weather anomalies. Each theory made sense on its own, and each one failed under scrutiny. There were no radar contacts indicating hostile interceptors, no reports of flak bursts, no weather systems severe enough to scatter or destroy an entire formation. On paper, the mission remained safe, and that was precisely the problem. Intelligence had evaluated the mission based on what it knew, not on what it failed to see. The hidden variable was not a single weapon or a dramatic technological breakthrough. It was a convergence of overlooked factors, each dismissed as insignificant when considered alone. Together, they created a perfect trap. Enemy planners had spent months studying predictable flight corridors, altitude bands, radio habits, and timing windows. What Allied intelligence classified as routine was, from the other side, a pattern begging to be exploited. The squadron flew a route considered low risk precisely because it had been used repeatedly without incident. That repetition bred confidence, and confidence bred complacency. Reconnaissance reports showed no enemy buildup, but those reports relied heavily on visual confirmation and conventional radar sweeps. They did not account for low probability tactics designed to avoid detection rather than confront it. Intelligence saw absence as safety, not as potential preparation. One critical failure lay in the assumption that enemy action would be visible before it became lethal. Fighters would appear on radar. Flak would announce itself with bursts. Electronic interference would manifest as noise or jamming. But what if the objective was not to engage aircraft, but to isolate them? What if the goal was not destruction through firepower, but through disorientation and separation? Post-war analysis suggested the squadron had flown into a zone intentionally designed to fracture formations rather than destroy them outright. Subtle environmental manipulation, combined with carefully timed electronic disruption, could create the illusion of normal airspace, while quietly stripping pilots of coordination. Radios did not scream with interference. They simply failed at the same moment, severing the squadron's nervous system in one stroke. The enemy understood something intelligence had underestimated. Air combat is not just physical, it is cognitive. Pilots depend on shared awareness. Formation integrity relies on trust in instruments and voices. Remove those elements, and even the most experienced squadron becomes vulnerable. The trap was not sprung by force, but by absence. No alarms, no immediate threat, just a sudden collapse of coordination. Another overlooked factor was altitude, layering. Intelligence evaluated threats at standard engagement levels, but failed to consider how operating just outside those layers could create blind spots. Aircraft positioned above or below expected bands would never appear on radar optimized for conventional intercepts. From the ground, everything looked clear. In the air, pilots unknowingly crossed into a zone where their advantages evaporated. Fuel calculations added another silent constraint. The mission profile left little margin for prolonged maneuvering or wide deviation. Once isolated pilots faced a narrowing set of options: break formation and search for contact, or maintain heading and risk flying deeper into an unknown threat environment. The enemy did not need to force a decision. Time and fuel would do that naturally. Perhaps the most damning intelligence failure was psychological. Analysts assumed that if something went wrong, pilots would report it immediately. But confusion does not always produce clear communication. When multiple systems fail simultaneously, pilots hesitate, double-check, and self-correct before escalating. Those seconds of hesitation are invisible in reports, but deadly in reality. By the time the situation felt serious enough to warrant a mayday, communication was already gone. The lone survivor would later explain that nothing felt overtly hostile at first. That was the brilliance of the trap. It exploited the human tendency to normalize anomalies. A flicker on the radio, a missing aircraft off the wing, a delayed response. Each moment encouraged rationalization rather than alarm. Intelligence had planned for aggression, not subtlety. When the truth finally emerged years later, it forced a painful reassessment of how missions were evaluated. Threats were no longer defined solely by visible weapons or enemy presence, but by the manipulation of predictability itself. The squadron had not been unlucky. It had been targeted precisely because it was routine. And that punto realization set the stage for the most unsettling question of all. If this trap worked once, how many times could it have been used without anyone ever knowing? Because the enemy tactic that followed was not only unexpected, it was devastatingly effective. What ultimately doomed the squadron was not superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but a tactic so unconventional that it slipped through every existing defensive assumption. The enemy did not seek a dogfight. They did not rush in with speed or announce their presence with tracers and flak. Instead, they weaponized expectation itself, turning predictability into a liability and discipline into a trap. At the core of this tactic was an understanding of how modern squadrons actually function in the air. Aircraft do not fight as individuals. They fight as networks. Radios, formation spacing, altitude discipline, timing windows, and mutual visibility form a single operational organism. The enemy realized that if you disrupt that organism at the right moment, you do not need to destroy each aircraft. You only need to prevent them from functioning together. The tactic began long before the squadron ever took off. Enemy planners studied previous missions, not just routes and altitudes, but human behavior. How long pilots stayed in formation before adjusting spacing, how often radio checks were performed, which frequencies were used first, and which were treated as backups. Even how quickly pilots tended to escalate from routine communication to emergency procedures. This was not guesswork. It was pattern analysis, refined over weeks and months. When the squadron entered the designated airspace, the trap did not close immediately. That delay was intentional. The goal was to let the pilots relax, to reinforce the illusion that nothing was wrong. Only once the formation was fully committed, fuel calculations locked in and turning back costly, did the disruption begin. Communications were not jammed in the traditional sense. There was no noise, no static, nothing that would trigger an immediate defensive reaction. Instead, the signal was quietly severed at multiple points simultaneously. This is what made the tactic so effective. Pilots are trained to respond aggressively to obvious threats, but they are trained to troubleshoot subtle problems. When radios fail cleanly, without interference, the instinct is to assume equipment malfunction, not enemy action. That hesitation buys precious time. And time was the enemy's most powerful weapon. As radio contact disappeared, formation integrity began to erode. Pilots adjusted positions slightly, trying to regain visual contact or compensate for missing aircraft. Those micro-adjustments compounded quickly. A small altitude change here, a slight course correction there, and suddenly the squadron was no longer a cohesive unit, but a series of isolated aircraft flying in the same general direction. At that point, the second phase of the tactic took effect. Enemy elements, positioned just outside expected engagement zones, began exploiting the fragmentation, not with mass attacks, but with precision isolation. One aircraft would be drawn off by a fleeting visual contact. Another would descend or climb to regain sight of a wingman who was no longer there. Each movement felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they dismantled the formation piece by piece. Crucially, the enemy avoided visible kills during the initial phase. No explosions meant no immediate alarm. No mayday calls meant no clear trigger for retreat. The squadron was not fighting. It was unraveling. By the time pilots realized they were no longer supported, they were already alone, low on situational awareness and operating without coordination. This tactic worked because it attacked the psychology of trained professionals. Military pilots are conditioned to trust systems and procedures. When those systems fail silently, the mind seeks technical explanations before tactical ones. The enemy exploited that delay ruthlessly. They understood that fear is not what breaks formations. Uncertainty is. By the time conventional combat finally occurred, it was no longer squadron versus enemy. It was individual versus environment, with the enemy choosing when and where to engage. Some aircraft were likely destroyed quickly. Others may have been forced down, disoriented, or driven into terrain or fuel exhaustion. The lack of distress call suggests many pilots never understood what was happening until it was too late. This tactic represented a shift in warfare philosophy. Victory did not come from overpowering the enemy, but from denying them the ability to function as a coordinated force. It was asymmetric, efficient, and devastating. And because it left so few visible traces, it was easy for official reports to misinterpret or minimize its significance. Only the lone survivor, who instinctively broke pattern at exactly the right moment, escaped the full effect of this strategy. His survival was not an accident. It was proof that the tactic depended entirely on predictability, and that raised a chilling implication. Any force that relied too heavily on routine could be erased the same way. From the inside of the cockpit, the collapse of the squadron did not feel dramatic at first. It felt wrong in a quiet, unsettling way. The lone survivor later explained that his instruments were all reading normal. His engine was stable, fuel flow steady, altitude locked. Nothing in front of him suggested danger. And yet, his situational awareness was slipping away faster than he could process it. The sky looked the same, but the context had vanished. The first emotional response was not fear. It was irritation. Radios fail. Headsets cut out. Pilots are trained to troubleshoot before reacting. He checked connections, switched frequencies, ran through memorized procedures. Each action took seconds, and each second reinforced the belief that this was a technical issue, not a tactical one. The assumption delayed the realization that would have triggered immediate evasive action. As he looked left and right, expecting to see wingmen holding formation, he saw only empty air. That absence created a mental lag. The human brain resists sudden discontinuity. It tries to reconcile reality with expectation. The pilot instinctively searched the sky where aircraft should have been, not where they might actually be. In those moments, confusion began to erode confidence. Then the radio crackled again. A half-second of sound. A voice cut short. That fragment carried panic in its tone, and panic is contagious even through static. The pilot's heart rate spiked. His breathing tightened. Training told him to slow down, to stay methodical. Instinct told him something catastrophic was unfolding faster than procedures could handle. Inside the cockpit, time began to compress. Small tasks felt larger. Decisions that normally took no thought suddenly demanded effort. He adjusted throttle settings without remembering why. He scanned the horizon repeatedly, each pass faster than the last. The absence of visual reference points made the sky feel immense and hostile. Alone at altitude, surrounded by nothing, a pilot becomes acutely aware of how fragile control really is. Panic does not arrive as hysteria. It arrives as narrowing focus. The surveyor described how his attention tunneled onto single details. A flicker on the instrument panel, a shadow in the clouds, the hum of the engine. That tunnel vision is deadly in air combat. It reduces awareness precisely when awareness is most needed, and the enemy tactic exploited that vulnerability perfectly. As confusion deepened, doctrine began to conflict internally. Maintain heading or turn back. Climb for visibility or descent to regain orientation. Stay on mission or abort. With no formation leader to follow and no radio guidance, every option carried risk. The wrong choice could burn fuel, expose him to unseen threats, or trap him deeper inside the kill zone. The psychological pressure intensified when he realized no one was answering him. Not a single acknowledgement, no reassurance, no confirmation that anyone else was still alive. That silence triggered a primitive response. Humans are not wired to operate completely alone in high-threat environments. The sense of abandonment sharpened fear into urgency. That urgency is where panic finally broke. Through discipline, his breathing became shallow. His grip tightened on the controls. The cockpit felt smaller, more confining. Every noise sounded louder. The engine pitch felt different, even though it was not. The pilot later admitted that this was the moment he came closest to making a fatal mistake. A rushed turn, an unnecessary dive, a desperate action taken simply to feel like he was doing something. What saved him was a split second of self-awareness. He recognized the signs of panic as they were happening. Years of training kicked in, not as procedure, but as mental restraint. He forced himself to slow his breathing. He reduced input on the controls. He widened his scan deliberately, fighting the tunnel vision. That internal battle mattered as much as anything that followed, because panic would have driven him back toward the last known position of the squadron, deeper into the trap. Control allowed him to do something else entirely. To break pattern, to stop reacting, and start choosing. In that instant, confusion transformed into clarity, not about what had happened, but about what he needed to do next. And that decision, made inside a silent cockpit surrounded by empty sky, would separate him from every other pilot who never came back. The decision that saved him did not come from a checklist or a manual. It came from instinct, sharpened by experience and a sudden understanding that everything he had been trained to do in formation was now working against him. In that instant, the pilot realized a brutal truth. Staying predictable meant staying vulnerable. Whatever had erased the squadron depended on repetition, on expected reactions, on disciplined obedience to procedure. Survival now required disobedience. Most pilots, when isolated, instinctively try to rejoin. They turn back toward the last known heading of the formation, climb to regain visual contact, or circle in widening arcs, hoping to spot friendly aircraft. That reflex had likely killed the others. Each attempt to reconnect would have drawn them back into the same invisible web, tightening it around them again and again. The survivor understood this just in time. Instead of turning toward where the squadron had been, he turned away from it. It was a choice that felt wrong at every level. Emotionally, it felt like abandonment. Tactically, it violated doctrine. Psychologically, it meant accepting that everyone else was already gone. But the logic was simple and ruthless. Eve, the trap, was built around the squadron's route and timing. The safest direction was the one no one else would choose. Unpredictability became protection. He cut throttles slightly and changed altitude in an irregular pattern, not climbing or descending smoothly, but in short, uneven adjustments. This was not about speed. It was about breaking any tracking solution that might already be forming against him. Smooth flight paths are easy to follow. Erratic ones force recalculation in air combat. Recalculation costs time, and time saves lives. At the same moment, he shut down all non-essential radio transmissions. Silence was no longer a threat. It was camouflage. If someone was listening, he would give them nothing to work with. No voice, no signal, no pattern, just an aircraft moving in a way that made no sense to anyone watching. The sky around him remained deceptively calm. No fighters appeared. No flak burst below. That calm was almost worse than violence. It suggested that danger was not reactive, but patient. Somewhere, something was waiting for him to behave normally again. He refused to give it that opportunity. Fuel calculations ran through his mind constantly. Every maneuver burned margin. Every minute increased risk. But returning directly to base felt like flying back through a door that might already be closed. So he didn't. He diverted toward an alternate recovery zone that had not been part of the original mission plan, a place unlikely to be covered by whatever system had been prepared for the squadron. This choice required confidence bordering on arrogance. He had to trust his navigation without confirmation, trust his judgment without validation, trust that being alone was safer than being where he was expected to be. That kind of trust is rare in combat pilots because it places responsibility entirely on the individual. There is no leader to blame, no formation to hide inside. As minutes passed without contact, the pilot began to realize something chilling. Whatever had happened was not following him. The trap had not adjusted. It had not chased. That silence confirmed his suspicion. The enemy was not hunting aircraft. They were harvesting formations. By refusing to behave like a formation element, he had stepped outside the logic of the attack. He was no longer a target worth the effort. That realization brought no relief, only dread, because it meant the others never had a chance once the sequence began. When he finally crossed into airspace, where friendly radar coverage returned, his hands were trembling again, not from panic, but from delayed shock. He checked in with base using a guarded, clipped transmission. This time, the radio answered immediately. The sound of a human voice responding nearly overwhelmed him. He was alive not because he was the best pilot in the squadron, but because he was the only one who chose to stop acting like part of it. And that decision, made in a fraction of a second inside a silent cockpit, would soon force commanders to confront an impossible question. If survival required breaking doctrine, what did that say about the doctrine itself? The return itself should not have been possible. By every standard measure of wartime aviation logic, the pilot should have been intercepted, forced down, or lost to fuel exhaustion long before he reached friendly territory. And yet, mile by mile, he kept flying through airspace that had just erased an entire squadron without leaving. What made his escape extraordinary was not speed or firepower, but the way he refused to re-enter the logic of the event that destroyed the others. He never flew straight for long. Straight lines create expectations. Expectations create solutions for the enemy. Instead, he treated the sky like hostile terrain, even though nothing appeared there. Minor heading changes every few minutes. Small altitude shifts that served no navigational purpose other than to disrupt any potential tracking. If someone was watching, he wanted them guessing. If no one was watching, the cost was minimal. In war, uncertainty favors the cautious, not the efficient. As fuel ticked down, pressure mounted. Every deviation from the shortest route carried a penalty. The temptation to commit, to choose a single heading and stick to it, grew stronger with each passing minute. That temptation had likely killed the others. Commitment creates confidence, but confidence is exactly what the trap punished. The pilot resisted it, choosing doubt over certainty. At one point, he crossed beneath a broken cloud layer and briefly considered climbing above it to regain visual range. He rejected the idea immediately. Altitude equals exposure. If the enemy tactic relied on layered airspace control, then vertical predictability was as dangerous as horizontal. He stayed low enough to complicate detection, high enough to preserve fuel efficiency, threading a narrow band where the aircraft was. Hardest to categorize. The most unsettling part of the return was the absence of pursuit. No fighters closed in, no warning lights flashed. No defensive maneuvers were required. That absence reinforced a horrifying conclusion. The enemy had never intended to chase survivors. The operation had been designed to remove a formation from the battle space, not to hunt stragglers. Once the formation ceased to exist, the mission was complete. Several times, the pilot passed through airspace where he expected friendly contact and found none. Radar coverage returned gradually, not as a single reassuring handoff, but as a series of intermittent confirmations. Each one felt unreal. He half expected the radio to go silent again, for the nightmare to resume. Instead, voices remained steady. Procedures worked. The world began to behave normally again. When he finally approached the base, protocol demanded a standard recovery pattern. He ignored it. Instead of entering the prescribed circuit, he requested a direct approach, citing fueled concerns. Controllers hesitated, then approved. Even now, he refused to be predictable. He had learned that lesson too well. Touchdown was anticlimactic. No cheering, no celebration, just the sudden realization that the engine noise had stopped and he was alive. Only after the canopy opened did the weight of what had happened begin to crush him. Ground crews stared at the empty sky behind him, waiting for an aircraft that never appeared. Someone asked where the rest were. He did not answer immediately, because he did not know how. Debriefing began within minutes. Questions came fast and relentless. Headings, altitudes, timings, radio behavior, visual contacts. Every detail mattered, but what unsettled the intelligence officers most was what he did not report. No enemy fighters, no flak, no explosions, no conventional engagement. His survival narrative did not fit any existing model of loss. That made his return impossible in the eyes of doctrine. Squadrons did not simply vanish. Aircraft did not escape events they could not describe. Yet here he was, living evidence that the event had rules, and that those rules could be broken by someone willing to abandon expectation. The pilot's aircraft was inspected thoroughly. No damage, no anomalies, no explanation. The plane that survived looked identical to the ones that did not, which meant the difference was not mechanical. It was behavioral. That conclusion disturbed commanders more than any technical failure ever could, because if survival depended on acting incorrectly at exactly the right moment, then training itself needed to be questioned, and that realization set off a chain reaction far beyond this single incident, one that would only become visible years later when the official story began to crack. The moment the lone aircraft rolled to a stop on the runway, the reality of the situation hit the base with brutal force. Ground crews, controllers, and officers stood frozen, staring at empty sky that should have been filled with returning aircraft. Engines should have been roaring. Crews should have been taxing. Instead, there was only one plane, one pilot, and a silence far heavier than the one that had swallowed the squadron in the air. Shock came first, not emotional shock, but operational paralysis. Procedures existed for damaged aircraft, missing aircraft, even heavy losses, but there was no checklist for total disappearance without contact. Controllers rechecked logs. Radio operators replayed recordings. Navigation officers traced routes again and again, convinced they had missed something obvious. The human mind resists accepting outcomes that lack a clear cause, and this outcome had none. Denial followed quickly. Some officers argued the squadron must have diverted. Others suggested delayed returns caused by weather or fuel miscalculations. A few insisted radio equipment failure explained everything. These explanations were comforting because they preserved the belief that doctrine still worked. If the loss could be blamed on coincidence or error, then the system remained sound. But the survivor's presence complicated that narrative. His aircraft showed no battle damage. His fuel state matched his account. His flight path, once reconstructed, showed deliberate deviation rather than confusion. He had not wandered off course. He had escaped something, and that implied intention on the other side. Deep breathing stretched for hours. Intelligence officers pressed for enemy sightings. Operations demanded precise timings. Engineers searched for mechanical anomalies. Each discipline looked for failure within its own domain, and each came up empty. The story refused to fit inside existing frameworks that made it dangerous. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted. Once the possibility of enemy involvement could no longer be dismissed, fear entered the room. If an entire squadron could be neutralized without combat, then no mission was truly safe. Predictability, once considered a strength, now looked like exposure. The search for wreckage began reluctantly. Aircraft were dispatched along the planned route, scanning for debris, oil slicks, parachutes, anything. Nothing was found. No smoke columns, no floating fragments. The absence of physical evidence deepened the mystery and intensified the unease. It was as if the squadron had been erased rather than destroyed. Rumors spread through the base. Some pilots whispered about experimental enemy technology. Others blamed secret intelligence failures being quietly covered up. A few questioned whether the survivor had truly seen what he thought he had. When explanations are scarce, speculation thrives. Official reports began to take shape, but they were cautious, vague, and deliberately narrow. Language mattered. Phrases like presumed lost replaced destroyed, unknown circumstances replaced enemy action. The goal was not clarity, but containment. Panic was the real enemy on the ground. The survivor himself became an uncomfortable figure. He was questioned repeatedly, sometimes by the same officers, asking the same questions in different ways. Consistency was tested. Details were scrutinized, not because he was suspected of lying, but because his account threatened to establish understanding. If he was right, then the system had failed catastrophically. Morale suffered. Pilots scheduled for upcoming missions studied maps, longer, questioned briefings more aggressively, and listened to radio silence with new dread. The sky had become less predictable, and unpredictability erodes confidence faster than enemy fire. As days passed, without new information, a quiet decision emerged among senior leadership. The full implications of the event would not be acknowledged publicly. Not yet. The official narrative would focus on loss, not method, on tragedy, not vulnerability. But beneath that controlled surface, something had shifted permanently. The disappearance forced an unspoken admission. War had entered a phase where battles could be lost without being fought, and formations could die without ever seeing their enemy. And years later, when documents were reopened and suppressed details surfaced, that realization would become impossible to ignore, because the truth that eventually emerged was far more unsettling than any explanation offered at the time. In the weeks that followed, the official explanation settled into place with careful wording and deliberate restraint. Reports concluded that the squadron had been lost due to unknown operational factors, possibly compounded by navigation errors, equipment malfunction, or environmental conditions. No single cause was identified, and that ambiguity was intentional. A vague conclusion was safer than a precise one that exposed systemic vulnerability. The incident was filed, classified, and quietly removed from operational discussion. On paper, the case was closed. In reality, it had barely begun. Years later, fragments of the truth began to surface in ways no one had anticipated. Declassified intelligence files revealed that the enemy had been experimenting with non-kinetic methods of airspace denial far earlier than Allied planners realized. These were not science fiction weapons or exotic machines, but carefully coordinated tactics combining electronic disruption, environmental exploitation, and psychological modeling of pilot behavior. The goal was never to win a dogfight. It was to make the dogfight unnecessary. One document described an enemy doctrine focused on cognitive isolation, a strategy designed to collapse unit cohesion before combat began. Formation flying was treated as a vulnerability rather than a strength. If pilots could be separated mentally and operationally, they would defeat themselves through fuel exhaustion, terrain, collision, or piecemeal engagement. Losses would appear accidental. Attribution would be delayed. Accountability would vanish into ambiguity. What made this revelation so disturbing was how closely it matched the survivor's account. The clean radio silence, the absence of visible attackers, the gradual disintegration rather than sudden destruction. Everything aligned. The squadron had not been overwhelmed. It had been unstitched. Further analysis revealed that similar tactics may have been used in other theaters, producing unexplained losses that were never fully investigated. Isolated aircraft missing over familiar routes, patrols that vanished without contact, incidents dismissed as weather or mechanical failure because no enemy presence could be proven. The pattern was there, but it took hindsight to recognize it. The survivor's testimony, once treated as an anomaly, suddenly became a key data point. His decision to break pattern was not luck. It was the only variable that changed the outcome. By abandoning formation logic, he removed himself from the enemy's predictive model. The system was never designed to chase individuals. It was designed to collapse groups. This raised an uncomfortable question for military planners. How many losses attributed to chance or error were actually the result of unseen, unacknowledged tactics? And how many doctrines were still training pilots to behave in ways that made them easier to predict, isolate, and destroy? The truth that emerged later was not dramatic in the way history often prefers. There was no single villain, no secret weapon revealed in a triumphant report. Instead, there was a quiet realization that modern warfare had evolved faster than doctrine and that discipline without adaptability had become dangerous. The official explanation had protected morale in the short term, but in the long term, it delayed learning. It postponed the moment when forces had to confront the fact that the enemy was no longer fighting only in physical space, but in cognitive space as well. And that delay nearly costs far more than one squadron, because the lesson learned too late from this disappearance would eventually force a fundamental shift in how air combat was planned, taught, and executed. The disappearance of the squadron did not reshape air combat overnight. In fact, its influence was subtle at first, almost invisible, buried beneath new battles, new losses, and new priorities. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had cracked. For the first time, military planners were forced to confront a deeply unsettling idea. Air superiority could be challenged without direct confrontation, and entire units could be neutralized without traditional combat ever taking place. In the months that followed, quiet adjustments began to appear in training manuals and operational briefings. Language shifted. Predictability, once praised as professionalism, started being discussed as a potential weakness. Formation discipline remained essential, but rigid adherence without contingency planning was now questioned. Pilots were encouraged to think beyond procedures, to recognize when systems themselves might be the threat. One of the most significant doctrinal changes involved communication failure response. Previously, loss of radio contact was treated primarily as a technical problem. After this incident, it began to be treated as a potential tactical indicator. Silence was no longer neutral. It became a warning sign. Pilots were trained to assume hostile intent when multiple systems failed cleanly and simultaneously, and to act decisively rather than troubleshoot indefinitely. Another shift came in how formations were taught to adapt under uncertainty. Instead of prioritizing immediate reformation at all costs, pilots were instructed to value survivability and unpredictability. Breaking pattern, once considered dangerous, was reframed as a viable defensive response under specific conditions. The lone survivor's decision, once viewed as reckless, became a case study in adaptive thinking. Electronic warfare doctrine also evolved. Commanders began to understand that battle space control did not require visible dominance. Denying coordination could be as effective as destroying aircraft. This realization accelerated investment in countermeasures, redundant systems, and training focused on operating with degraded information. The goal was no longer perfect control, but functional resilience. Perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Trust in doctrine became conditional. Pilots were taught not just what to do, but when to stop doing it. That distinction mattered. Air combat shifted from being purely procedural to being deeply judgment when secondary to execution moved to the center of survival. The vanished squadron became a quiet reference point, rarely named directly, but frequently implied. Instructors would say, there are situations where following the book will get you killed, and everyone understood what they meant. The lesson was not about disobedience, but about awareness. Doctrine was a tool, not a shield. Over time, this mindset influenced broader military thinking. Joint operations emphasized flexibility. Rigid synchronization gave way to adaptive coordination. Commanders accepted that perfect information was a myth, and that uncertainty had to be managed, not eliminated. The squadron never returned. No wreckage was officially recovered. No definitive explanation was ever publicly acknowledged, but its absence reshaped the future. It forced militaries to recognize that the most dangerous threats are not always the loudest or most visible, but the ones that quietly dismantle how you think, communicate, and decide. And in that sense, the pilot who returned did more than survive. He carried back a warning written in silence, one that changed how wars in the sky would be fought from that moment forward. If you made it all the way here, you are not a passive viewer. You followed a story about discipline, predictability, silence, and the moment where one decision meant the difference between total disappearance and survival. That alone already sets you apart. Now, take 10 seconds to make this story go further. Leave a comment below and write "Silence is a weapon." If this episode changed the way you think about air combat, strategy, or how wars are really decided beyond what official reports tell us, I read the comments, and your perspective helps shape the next stories we uncover here. If this video helped you understand something deeper about military history, doctrine, and the hidden side of warfare, hit the like button. It tells the platform that this kind of serious, story-driven content matters and deserves to be seen. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video already appearing on your screen, where we dive into another forgotten moment that rewrote the rules of war without most people ever realizing it. Thank you for watching until the very end. Your attention is what keeps these stories alive.